For 23 days, Lyra Ashenvale had not sat down. Not at breakfast. Not during evening roll call. Not even in the narrow servants' room where her knees shook so badly she had to grip the wall until dawn. Silvermere Pack called it a training accident. Lyra called it what it was. A lie. And by noon, Alpha King Kael Noctharrow would enter Silvermere's Blackstone Hall to sign a treaty with the very wolves who had buried that lie beneath polished floors, clean uniforms, and smiling mouths. Behind the records counter, Lyra pressed one trembling hand against the wood and tried not to fall. The Moonstone Ledger lay open before her, its old pages filled with births, deaths, territory claims, vows, punishments, marriages, and every official truth Silvermere had ever chosen to keep, except hers. Her name appeared only once. Lyra Ashenvale. Minor injury during routine training. Cleared by healer Silas Veyer. The ink looked normal to anyone else. To Lyra, it looked like a door sealed from the outside. A sharp wave of pain climbed through her spine. She swallowed it down and tightened her fingers around the counter's edge. Lyra. Dear, Eldamaro said from the doorway. Carrying a tray of tea, no one had asked Lyra to drink. You look pale again. Lyra lifted her eyes. It hurts when I sit. The words were quiet. Too quiet for a hall full of wolves. Maybe. But Elda heard them. Her lined face changed for half a second, softening with grief, then hardening with fear. Pain teaches endurance. Elda murmured. Your mother used to say that. My mother stopped looking at me after it happened. Elda flinched. Across the hall, two clerks pretended to sort treaty papers. One of them turned a page that did not need turning. Lyra almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because Silvermere had become very skilled at movement without action. Cups were carried. Doors were opened. Ledgers were stacked. Heads bowed. No one helped. No one asked. No one wanted the answer. Elda set the tray down. Drink something before the king arrives. The king, Elda lowered her voice. Alpha King Kael Noctharrow. Nightcrest realm. He is already at the eastern ridge. The room changed around that name. Even the clerk stopped pretending. Kael Noctharrow was not the kind of king mothers used in bedtime stories. He was the kind named in warnings. The cold ruler of Nightcrest. The alpha who had ended 3 border wars without raising his voice. The man whose royal oath ring was said to freeze when a lie was spoken before him. Lyra looked down at the Moonstone Ledger. The page beneath her hand had gone cold. Not cool. Cold. A thin silver line moved through the ink of her false record, splitting the words training accident down the middle. Lyra stopped breathing. Elda saw it too. The old woman backed away so quickly the teacups rattled. Close it? Elda whispered. Lyra did not. For 23 days, everyone had told her to close her mouth. Lower her eyes. Let the pack heal. Let the story settle. Let powerful sons remain powerful, and quiet daughters remain grateful. But now the ledger itself was refusing to stay silent. A door opened at the far end of the hall. Nessavale stepped inside with a stack of border reports clutched to her chest. She had once been Lyra's closest friend. Before the old training yard, before the ropes, before the official story, before Nessa learned how easy it was to survive by looking away, her gaze dropped to the open ledger, then to Lyra's face. You should not have that page open. Nessa said. Lyra's voice came out thin but steady. Why? Nessa's lips parted. Behind her, bells rang once from the courtyard tower. The royal convoy had crossed the gate. Every wolf in the records hall straightened as if a hand had pulled their spines upright. Lyra turned the page before anyone could stop her. The next sheet was blank. Not empty. Scraped? Someone had removed the witness list. A memory flashed through her. Dark ground. Cold air. Maddox's gray marks laugh cutting through the night. And 3 silhouettes standing near the training yard fence. Watching. Not helping. Watching. Lyra reached beneath the counter, where her fingers found the hidden copy she had made before healer Silas locked the original away. Nessa saw the movement. Her face went white. "Lyra," she whispered. "If they find that on you, Garrick will say you forged it. Then maybe the king should see it first." The hall doors opened. Not fully. Just enough for winter air to spill across the floor. And the Moonstone Ledger, still beneath Lyra's shaking hand, turned every false word silver. The doors of Silvermere's main hall opened, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. Cold air rolled in first. Then came the royal guards of Nightcrest Realm. Dressed in black coats, clasped at the throat with silver moons, they did not shout. They did not announce themselves twice. They entered with the silent discipline of wolves who served a king powerful enough to make noise unnecessary. Behind them walked Alpha King Kael Noctharrow. Every conversation in the hall died. Lord Garrick Thornfell stepped forward at once, smiling with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent all morning hiding rot beneath fresh flowers. "Your Majesty," Garrick said, bowing low, "Silvermere Pack welcomes you with loyalty and open hands." Kael stopped beneath the iron chandelier. He was taller than Lyra expected. Broader, too, though there was nothing careless in the way he carried strength. His black coat was plain except for the dark metal ring on his right hand, set with a frost-white stone. His hair was the color of midnight rain, swept back from a face too controlled to be called handsome in any gentle way. But his eyes were what made the hall forget how to breathe. Pale gray. Still. Winter, over a blade. "Open hands," Kael repeated. His voice was low, calm, almost soft. The white stone in his ring clouded with frost. No one moved. Garrick's smile faltered for less than a second. "Of course. Your Majesty, Silvermere has nothing to hide." The frost thickened. A faint crack whispered through the ring. Lyra heard it from behind the records counter. So did Kael. His gaze shifted. Not toward Garrick, not toward the elders lined in ceremonial gray, not toward the polished treaty table set with silver cups and fresh ink, toward the records hall. Toward her. Lyra's fingers tightened around the hidden witness copy beneath the counter. For one impossible heartbeat, the distance between them seemed to disappear. Kael looked at her as if he could see every place where Silvermere had taught her to stand still and suffer quietly. His gaze did not soften. That would have been worse. Pity was easy. Pity cost nothing. What crossed his face was sharper. Recognition. As if he had found a broken law standing in human form. Garrick followed the king's stare and stiffened. "Ah," he said lightly. Too lightly. "That is only Lyra Ashenvale, our records keeper. A dutiful girl, though not well suited for formal company today." Only. The word landed with old weight. Lyra had been only many things. Only tired. Only dramatic. Only shaken from training. Only a girl who should be grateful the pack still had a place for her. Kael turned his head back to Garrick. "Why is your records keeper standing as though the floor is punishing her?" Silence struck the room harder than a shout. One elder cleared his throat. "The girl had a minor training accident. Your Majesty. Nothing that concerns the treaty." The Moonstone Ledger under Lyra's palm went colder. The false words on the open page shone silver. Kael's gaze dropped to the ledger. "Minor," he said. He took one step toward the counter. Garrick moved quickly, placing himself half a pace in the king's path. "The treaty room has been prepared. We thought you might prefer to begin with border terms before inspecting records. I did not ask what you prepared." No anger. No raised voice. Still. Garrick stepped aside. Kael crossed the hall. Every wolf watched him approach Lyra, and every watched breath made her want to shrink behind the counter. She forced herself not to. Her legs trembled. Her back burned. Her hands stayed flat on the Moonstone Ledger. Kael stopped several feet away. Not close enough to trap her. Close enough to see. "What is your name?" he asked. Garrick answered before she could. "Lyra Ashenvale." "Daughter of—" I asked her. The hall went still again. Lyra's throat tightened. For 23 days. Everyone had spoken around her. Oh, her hair. For heir, they had told the story until even the walls seemed tired of the lie. Now the Alpha King waited. Not commanding, waiting. Lyra Ashenvale, she said. Her voice did not break. Kael looked at the ledger. Is that your record? A dozen wolves inhaled at once. Nessa, near the doorway, shook her head almost imperceptibly. A warning. A plea. Maybe both. Lyra looked down at the silver-split ink. Minor injury during routine training. Cleared by healer Silas Vare. The hidden copy beneath her fingers felt hotter than fire. Yes, she said. That is what they wrote. Kael's eyes lifted to hers. What happened? Garrick's voice cut in. Smooth but strained. Your Majesty? Surely this can wait until after. The ring cracked again. This time, the sound traveled through the hall like ice breaking across a lake. Kael did not look away from Lyra. No one will correct her memory before she is ready to speak. The words settled over the room like a royal decree. Lyra's chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with her wounds. Kael turned, slowly, and faced the elders. Garrick, Silas Vare standing pale near the medicine archway, and every wolf who had learned to survive by lowering their eyes. I came to Silvermere for a treaty, Kael said. But treaties are built on trust. He lifted his frost-rimmed hand, and this room is full of lies. Behind Lyra, the Moonstone Ledger turned another line, silver. Then another. Then every false word on the page began to glow. No one in Silvermere moved while the Moonstone Ledger glowed. It did not blaze like fire. It did not scream the truth for them. It simply shone with a cold, silver light beneath Lyra's palm, turning every false word beautiful enough to be damning. Minor injury. Routine training. Cleared. Each phrase glimmered like frost over a grave. Alpha King Kael Noctharrow looked at the page for a long moment. Then he looked at healer Silas Vare. Silas had been standing near the medicine archway, his gray healer's coat buttoned to the throat, his hands folded with careful calm, but his face had lost color. Bring me the healer ledger, Kael said. Silas blinked once. Your Majesty, the ledger you used to clear her. A thin silence followed. Lord Garrick Thornfell stepped forward before Silas could answer. With respect, healer records are protected under Silvermere law. We would never deny your Majesty ordinary pack records. But medical documents are private. Kael's expression did not change. Private, he repeated. Not sacred. Garrick's jaw tightened. Our laws are old. So are lies? The frost on Kael's ring thickened. Lyra felt the cold from where she stood. It moved through the counter, into the Moonstone Ledger, up through her fingers. Not painful, not gentle either. It felt like a door unlocking somewhere beneath the floor. Silas cleared his throat. The girl was examined. She was given salve. She was advised to rest. Lyra almost laughed. Rest. For 23 days. She had slept standing against a wall because bending wrong sent white sparks through her vision. She had worked double shifts because Garrick said idleness bred rumors. She had watched trays pass her by because her name had been quietly removed from the meal board. But Silas said rest, and half the hall looked relieved. Rest was a comfortable word. Rest did not accuse anyone. Kael turned back to her. Were you advised to rest? The question was simple. That made it dangerous. Lyra looked past him at Garrick. At the elders. At Elda near the tea tray, hands trembling. At Nessa by the door, tears gathering but not falling. Then she looked at Silas. He told me some things were better left as accidents. The hall went colder. Silas's mouth parted. That is not what I meant. The Moonstone Ledger snapped shut by itself. The sound cracked through the room. Several wolves stepped back. Kael did not. He lowered his gaze to the closed cover, where the silver moonstone clasp had begun to pulse faintly. Once. Twice. Like a slow, hidden heartbeat. Open it, he said. Garrick's voice sharpened. Your Majesty. This is becoming an insult to Silvermere hospitality. Kael finally looked at him. No. This became an insult when a wounded records keeper stood in the center of your pack for 23 days, and every wolf here learned to call her silence, peace. No one answered, because there was no answer clean enough to survive the ledger. Kael looked around the hall then, taking in every bowed head, every clenched hand, every elder pretending not to understand what had already become clear. Something is wrong here, he said, his voice quiet enough that they had to lean toward it. And everyone in this pack has agreed not to see it. Lyra felt those words enter the room like a blade sliding beneath a locked door. Not pity. Not rescue. A witness. For the first time in 23 days. She did not feel insane for remembering. Kael turned back to her. Lyra Ashenvale. Her name sounded different in his mouth. Not softened. Not claimed. Recorded. Yes. Your Majesty, I will ask you one question. You may answer now. Later. Or not at all. Garrick's eyes narrowed. Kael ignored him. Do you feel safe speaking in this hall? The answer rose so quickly it frightened her. No. No. Because Maddox Greymark could walk in smiling, and everyone would make room for him. No. Because Silas held the healer ledger. No. Because Garrick controlled the guards. No. Because Nessa had seen and said nothing. No. Because her own mother had looked toward the window when Lyra whispered the truth. Lyra's fingers tightened on the counter. No, she said. A sound passed through the hall. Not outrage. Not shame. Something worse. Recognition. Kael nodded once, as if her answer had confirmed a law already written in his bones. Then this hall is no longer neutral ground. Garrick went very still. You cannot seize jurisdiction over an allied pack without formal cause. Kael lifted his ringed hand. The frost-white stone was split clean through the center now, glowing with trapped moonlight. Formal cause has presented itself behind the counter. The Moonstone Ledger opened again. Its pages turned without touch. Births. Deaths. Territory claims punishments. Then it stopped on a page Lyra had never seen before. At the top, written in silver ink, was her name. Not Lyra Ashenvale. Records keeper. Lyra Ashenvale. Protected witness under royal law. And beneath it, another line appeared. Witness list removed. Original names concealed. Kael read it. So did Garrick. So did Silas. Lyra heard someone gasp. Then the ledger wrote one final sentence across the page. The missing witness stands in this room. The words remained on the Moonstone Ledger long after the hall fell silent. The missing witness stands in this room. No one asked who. That was how Lyra knew everyone already had a name in mind. Nessa Vale stood by the door. Her stack of border reports pressed so tightly to her chest that the parchment bent beneath her fingers. She did not look at Lyra. She did not look at the ledger. She stared at the floor as if the black stone might open and save her from being seen. Lord Garrick Thornfell recovered first. A dramatic enchantment, he said, with a small, strained laugh. Old ledgers are full of old temperaments. Silvermere records have always been sensitive to strong emotion. Kael Noctharrow turned the full weight of his gaze on him. Then I suggest your pack stop feeding them lies. No one laughed after that. Kael ordered the records hall sealed before sunset. No clerk was allowed to remove a page. No healer was allowed to alter a report. No elder was allowed near the Moonstone Ledger without a royal witness present. It should have made Lyra feel safer. It did not, because seals could be broken, guards could be bought, and in Silvermere, truth had a way of disappearing the moment powerful men found it inconvenient. That night, long after the treaty candles had been snuffed and the lodge had sunk into a restless, watchful silence, Lyra returned to the records hall. She should have stayed in her room. Kael had posted 2 Nightcrest guards near the eastern corridor. He had told her she owed no one another word tonight. He had said it calmly, with distance, as if even kindness had to ask permission before stepping closer. But Lyra had survived Silvermere by trusting fear when it sharpened. And tonight, fear told her The missing page would not survive until morning. She moved slowly through the dark hall, one hand brushing the wall for balance. Every step sent a dull ache through her body. But she kept going. Pain had become weather. She could not stop it from coming. She could only learn which way to walk beneath it. The records hall door was locked. Lyra reached into her sleeve and pulled out the small iron key she had copied years ago. Back when she still believed, knowing every lock in the lodge made her useful instead of dangerous. The door opened with a soft click. Moonlight lay across the shelves in pale bars. The Moonstone Ledger sat on the central table. Sealed with Kael's black wax and silver thread, Lyra did not touch it. Not yet. Instead, she went behind the counter, knelt with difficulty, and felt beneath the bottom drawer until her fingers found the split in the wood. The hidden copy was still there. Her breath left her in a shaky rush. She pulled it free. One folded sheet, thin, ordinary, worth more than every polished vow Silvermere had spoken that day. Lyra unfolded it under the moonlight. Witness record. Old Northern Training Yard. Maddox Greymark. Silas Veur. Elder Corvin Thale. Nessavale. Lyra stared at the last name until the letters blurred. She had known. Some part of her had always known. But seeing it written made the old wound inside her chest open in a quieter place. You found it. Lyra spun too fast and caught the edge of the counter. Nessa stood in the doorway, pale as candle ash. For a moment, neither girl spoke. They had once shared winter apples behind the kitchen house. They had once braided each other's hair before moon festivals. Nessa had once sworn, hand over heart, that if the world ever turned cruel, they would stand together. Then the world had turned cruel, and Nessa had stood near the fence. I didn't know what Maddox would do, Nessa whispered. Lyra folded the page carefully. But you knew what he had done. Tears gathered in Nessa's eyes. Garrick said, if I spoke, my family would lose their house. Silas said you would heal. Maddox said no one would believe you anyway. And you believed him. No. Nessa's voice broke. That was worse. I knew he was lying. A sound came from the corridor. Both of them froze. Footsteps. Not Nightcrest discipline. Silvermere boots. Fast. Familiar. Nessa grabbed Lyra's wrist, then let go instantly. As if remembering Lyra had every reason to hate being touched without warning. Hide it. She breathed. Lyra looked at the sealed Moonstone Ledger. The royal wax protected the cover, not the spine. She crossed to the table, lifted the ledger just enough to slide the folded witness copy into the loosened leather beneath its back binding, then lowered it again. The moonstone clasp pulsed once, accepting the secret like a swallowed star. The door opened. A Silvermere guard stepped inside with a lantern raised. His eyes went first to Nessa, then to Lyra. What are you doing here? Nessa's mouth opened, but no sound came. Lyra straightened behind the table, her hands empty. For the first time in 23 days, she did not lower her gaze. I work here, she said. The guard's eyes narrowed. Not tonight. Behind him, another shadow moved in the corridor. Tall, still, crowned in cold. Kael Noctharrow stepped into the doorway. No, he said quietly. Tonight, she testifies here. By morning, Silvermere had learned a new kind of fear. Not the loud fear that sent wolves running. A quieter fear. The kind that made servants polish the same silver cup 3 times. The kind that made elders whisper behind closed doors and stop speaking when Lyra Ashenvale passed. The kind that made Lord Garrick Thornfell smile at everyone as if his teeth were the only thing holding his face together. The records hall remained sealed. 2 Nightcrest guards stood outside its doors. Black coats, still as shadows. No Silvermere clerk was allowed inside. No healer. No elder. Not even Garrick. And Lyra, who had spent years being treated like part of the furniture, suddenly found every eye turning away too quickly when she entered a room. That should have pleased her. It only made her colder. because wolves did not look away from guilt the same way they looked away from pity. At noon, a second convoy arrived. This one did not carry soldiers. It carried silk. The carriages were white lacquer trimmed in silver, their wheels silent over the frost-stiff road. Pale banners snapped in the wind, each embroidered with a white thorned rose. Servants rushed to the courtyard. Elders straightened their robes. Even Garrick stepped out with visible relief, as if help had finally come, wearing perfume and pearls. Lyra stood near the medicine archway, one hand braced discreetly against the wall. She knew before anyone said the name: Celeste Frostmere. The woman the Alpha Council wanted Kael Noctharrow to marry. The perfect Luna candidate. The kind of woman kingdoms were built around. Celeste stepped from the carriage in a gown of winter white velvet. Her silver blonde hair pinned beneath a veil, so delicate it looked woven from mist. She was beautiful in the way frozen lakes were beautiful. Smooth, bright, and dangerous to trust. She offered Garrick her hand. "My lord," she said, voice soft as falling snow. "I heard Silvermere's treaty visit had become complicated." Garrick bowed over her fingers. "Lady Celeste, your presence honors us." "No," she said, smiling faintly. "His Majesty honors you. I am only here to remind everyone of what must not be lost." Her eyes moved across the courtyard, past the elders, past the guards, past the servants. They stopped on Lyra. For 1 second, the softness vanished. It was not disgust. Disgust would have been simple. Celeste looked at Lyra as if she had found an old door unlocked. Then the smile returned. "And who is this?" Garrick answered too quickly. "A record servant, no one of consequence." Lyra's fingers curled against the stone wall. "No one. Only. Harmless. Wolfless in all but name." Some had once whispered, because her wolf had been quiet since childhood, and her rank meant less than her usefulness. Celeste walked toward her. Every step was graceful enough to feel rehearsed. "You look unwell," Celeste said. Lyra held her gaze. "I have been told that often." "How unfortunate." Celeste tilted her head. "Girls in pain sometimes imagine patterns where there are none. A missing page becomes a conspiracy. A cold ledger becomes magic. A king's attention becomes hope." The words were gentle. The cut beneath them was not. Lyra's breath caught, but she did not look down. Before she could answer, the courtyard shifted. Kael Noctharrow had emerged from the eastern hall. He wore black again, without ornament except for the cracked oath ring on his hand. The frost-white stone caught the pale daylight and glimmered like a warning. Celeste turned toward him at once. "Your Majesty." Her curtsy was perfect. Kael stopped several paces away. "Lady Frostmere." "I came as soon as I heard." Celeste's eyes softened with practiced concern. "The council worries. Silvermere is an important ally, and one wounded servant should not be allowed to endanger a realm's peace." The courtyard went silent. Lyra felt the sentence land on her skin. One wounded servant. Kael's face did not change, but the frost inside his ring thickened. Celeste noticed. Her gaze flicked down too quickly. "Interesting," Lyra thought. Kael saw that flicker too. "You know about the ring," he said. Celeste smiled. "Everyone knows the legends of Nightcrest. Legends rarely make noble women nervous." A faint stain of color touched Celeste's cheeks. Garrick stepped in. "Your Majesty." Lady Celeste only means to preserve stability. Perhaps the girl should be moved somewhere quieter while the treaty resumes. For her own comfort, Celeste looked back at Lyra. "Yes," she said softly. "Rest would be kind. Records, halls, and royal hearings are no place for someone so fragile." Fragile. Lyra almost heard Maddox laughing in the dark. She pushed away from the wall. Pain flared, sharp enough to blur the courtyard. But she stayed upright. "I am not leaving the records hall." Celeste's eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. Then Kael moved. Not toward Celeste. Toward Lyra. He stopped at her side, leaving space between them. But the choice was unmistakable. A murmur passed through Silvermere. Celeste watched that space like it offended her. Kael lifted his hand slightly. Palm open toward the sealed records hall. Lyra Ashenvale is a protected witness under royal law. Until the hearing ends. No one moves her. No one isolates her. No one speaks for her. Celeste's smile thinned. How noble, she said, but dangerous. Some girls learn quickly how to use a king's guilt. The oath ring cracked again. This time, the sound was small, clean, final. Lyra looked down. So did Celeste. For the first time since arriving, the perfect Luna candidate looked afraid. Not of Kael, of Lyra. And from behind the sealed records hall doors, the Moonstone Ledger began to knock against the table. Once, twice, 3 times, as if something inside it had heard Celeste's voice and wanted out. The Moonstone Ledger knocked 3 times behind the sealed doors. Then Silvermere heard another sound. Hooves on the frozen road. Not royal engines. Not noble carriages. These came rougher. Faster. Breaking through the courtyard tension like something late to a funeral and proud of it. Lord Garrick Thornfell turned toward the gate. Relief crossed his face before he could hide it. Lyra saw it. So did Kael. A group of Silvermere riders entered the courtyard beneath the gray afternoon sky. Cloaks dusted with frost. Boots muddy from the northern trail. At their center rode Maddox Greymark. He looked exactly as Lyra remembered. Golden-haired, broad-shouldered, smiling, always smiling. As if every room, every road, every law had been built to forgive him before he even sinned. His horse slowed near the gathering. Maddox swung down with easy grace, removing his gloves, finger by finger, while his gaze moved over the courtyard. It touched Garrick first, then Celeste, then Kael. Only last did it find Lyra. His smile widened. Well, Maddox said, no one told me Silvermere was hosting a royal trial. Lyra's stomach tightened. The old training yard flashed through her mind in broken pieces. Cold air. Laughter. The sound of others watching and doing nothing. She forced the images down. Not gone. Never gone. Just folded away where they could not take her knees from under her. Maddox bowed to Kael. Low enough to look respectful. Not low enough to mean it. Your Majesty? Maddox Greymark. Northern Patrol Captain. I know who you are, Kael said. That should have warned him. It did not. Men like Maddox heard danger as applause until it was too late. His gaze slid back to Lyra. And I see our little records keeper has caused quite a stir. Kael did not move. But the air around him sharpened. Lyra spoke before he could. I did not cause what happened. Maddox gave a soft laugh. No. You only survived it loudly. The courtyard went still. Elda Marrow covered her mouth. Nessa Vale looked as though someone had struck the breath from her chest. Celeste Frostmere watched without blinking. Her white veil stirring in the wind like mist around a blade. Maddox took 1 step toward Lyra. Kael took 1 step too. Not in front of her. Beside her, the difference was small. Lyra felt it like shelter without walls. Maddox noticed and tilted his head. Careful, Your Majesty. Fragile little liars can become very convincing when powerful men pity them. The frost-white stone in Kael's ring flashed. Lyra's hand tightened against the wall. But she kept her eyes on Maddox. Then tell the truth, she said. His smile faltered. Only a little. But she saw it. You were not at the old northern training yard that night, she asked. Garrick's voice cut in. Lyra. Enough. Kael's eyes did not leave Maddox. Let him answer. Maddox spread his hands. I was on patrol. The sealed records hall doors groaned. Inside, something heavy moved. Every wolf turned. The Moonstone Ledger struck the table once. So hard the sound carried through the wood and stone. Maddox's smile vanished. Kael looked toward the doors. Open them. Garrick stepped forward. Your Majesty. The hall is under seal. Mean. A Nightcrest guard broke the silver thread and pushed the doors wide. The records hall waited in cold moon-gray silence. At the center table, the Moonstone Ledger had opened by itself. Pages fluttered, though no wind touched them. Birth records, treaties, punishments. Then the book stopped on the torn training record. The missing witness page had not returned, but the wound where it had been removed glowed silver. Kael entered first. Lyra followed slowly, refusing to let Maddox see how much each step cost her. The rest of the courtyard crowded at the threshold, too afraid to come closer and too hungry for scandal to leave. The ledger wrote one name across the torn space. Maddox Greymark. A whisper rose. Maddox laughed once. Sharp and false. A parlor trick. Old magic hates strong emotion. Everyone knows that. The ledger wrote another line. Present at Old Northern Training Yard. His face darkened. I was on patrol, he said again. This time, the royal oath ring cracked loud enough to silence the room. Lyra gasped. Not from fear, from the sudden pain beneath her ribs, brief and cold, as if the lie had passed too close through the air and brushed something hidden inside her. Kael felt it too. His gaze snapped to her hand where it had pressed against her chest. Then to Maddox. Your lie hurts her. Maddox's eyes flicked to Celeste. A mistake. Small. Fast. Fatal. Kael saw it. Celeste went very still. Lyra saw it too. And the world narrowed around a single, impossible thought. Maddox had not been protected by Silvermere alone. Someone outside the pack had known. Kael turned to the Nightcrest guards. Seal every gate. No rider leaves Silvermere. No message leaves by Raven. Runner. Or ring. Garrick's face hardened. You overstep? Kael looked at him then. Calm as winter judgment. No. I begin. Behind them, the Moonstone Ledger turned one more page. On the blank parchment, silver ink formed a question. Who ordered the record changed? By midnight, Silvermere had stopped pretending to sleep. No one left through the gates. No ravens rose from the towers. No messengers crossed the courtyard without a Nightcrest guard watching from the shadows. The treaty visit was over. The reckoning had begun. In the eastern guest chamber, Kael Noctharrow stood before the cold hearth and removed his glove one finger at a time. The royal oath ring looked worse beneath the candlelight. The frost-white stone had split through the center, and a thin web of ice crawled around the black metal band. It did not melt against his skin. It never had. Kael turned his hand slowly. The ring pulsed once. A sharp ache traveled through his knuckles, up his wrist, and into the old scar beneath his sleeve. He did not flinch. You should have left before sunset, said Lord Soren Veilheart from the doorway. Kael did not turn, and let Silvermere bury the evidence before morning. Soren entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He was older than Kael by 12 years. Narrow-faced, silver-eyed, and too loyal to soften bad news. He had served Kael's father before the Nightcrest throne passed into colder hands. The council will call this interference, Soren said. Garrick Thornfell will claim you insulted an allied pack. Celeste Frostmere's family will say you humiliated their daughter in public. Celeste knew the ring would react. Yes? Soren's expression darkened. That troubles me. Kael looked down at the cracked stone again. The Frostvale curse had haunted Nightcrest rulers for generations. It was not a song sung to children. It was not a romantic legend whispered under full moons. It was a royal punishment. Old and patient. A king of Nightcrest could lie. He could even survive a lie. But if he used the throne to protect a false oath, bury a witness, or crown a deception as law, the ring would freeze. Then crack? Then take something from him piece by piece. Warmth. Sleep. His wolf's peace. His ability to trust his own bond. Kael's father had died with the ring blackened to ash on his hand. Kael had sworn not to repeat him. Yet tonight, the ring had not reacted only to his choices. It had reacted to Lyra Ashenvale. Soren stepped closer. There is another problem. There are several. This one has a name. Soren paused. Lyra. Kael's jaw tightened. Soren noticed. Of course. He noticed everything. You looked at her in the courtyard as if the rest of Silvermere had vanished. She is a protected witness. She is more than that. The ring went colder. Kael closed his fist. Soren lowered his voice. If the council suspects a bond, they will use it against her. Garrick will claim she bewitched you. Celeste will call her a social climber. Maddox will say she invented everything to catch a king's attention. Kael turned then. The candle flames bent away from him. Then they will learn the cost of saying it. That is exactly what worries me. Soren said, You cannot shield her with anger. Not this time. If you make this personal too early, they will bury the case beneath your desire to defend her. Kael said nothing. Because Soren was right. Power could silence a room. It could not always make a room honest. Lyra needed evidence. Procedure. Witnesses. Law. A truth so firmly recorded that no elder, noblewoman, healer, or smiling patrol captain could scrape it from the page again. Kael walked to the writing desk, where the sealed reports from Silvermere lay in neat piles. Training records, meal ledgers, healer logs, border patrol schedules, all of them clean. Too clean. The ring did not crack when Maddox lied about patrol. Kael said, Not fully. Soren's brows drew together. But it reacted. It reacted when the lie touched her. He opened his hand. The cracked stone glowed faintly, like moonlight trapped beneath ice. The Frostvale curse does not answer every lie. If it did, no king of Nightcrest would survive a week at court. Soren went very still. What are you saying? Kael looked toward the sealed records hall beyond the window, where two black-coated guards stood beneath the moon. I think this curse is not punishing me for finding Lyra Ashenvale. The ring pulsed again. This time, the pain was not in his hand. It struck deeper, beneath the ribs, exactly where he had seen Lyra press her palm when Maddox lied. Soren saw his face change. Kael. The king breathed once through the cold. I think it is leading me to her. For several seconds, only the fireless hearth answered them with silence. Then Soren whispered, The old prophecy said the Frostvale curse would break only when the hidden heir stood before a false court and named the first lie. Kael's eyes sharpened. You told me that prophecy was incomplete. It is. Soren swallowed. The final line was destroyed before your coronation. The ring warmed suddenly. Not enough to comfort. Enough to warn. Kael turned back to the documents and picked up Lyra's false injury report. The ink silvered at the edges. Soren started. What does that mean? Kael read the page once. Then again. The answer was not in what had been written. It was in what had been removed. Someone did not attack Lyra only to silence a witness. He said. Outside. Beyond the glass. The sealed records hall. Candle flared blue. Kael's voice dropped. They attacked her before she could discover what she is. Lyra did not sleep. She stood beside the narrow window of the chamber Kael had ordered prepared for her, watching frost gather along the glass like pale fingers trying to get in. A bed waited behind her. Soft blankets. Clean sheets. A silver basin of warm water. Food on a covered tray. Things Silvermere had remembered how to give her only after a king noticed she had gone without them. She did not touch the bed. She did not trust comfort that arrived with witnesses. Near dawn. Someone knocked. Once. Not a servant's nervous flutter. Not a guard's fist. A question. Lyra turned slowly. Come in. The door opened, and Alpha King Kael Noctharrow stood outside with two Nightcrest guards behind him. He did not step over the threshold. May I enter? The words unsettled her more than a command would have. No one in Silvermere asked permission from girls like her. They opened doors. They gave orders. They decided which wounds mattered and which records stayed clean. Lyra tightened her fingers around the window frame. Yes. Kael entered alone. He stopped near the hearth, leaving half the room between them. His black coat was fastened to the throat. his dark hair still damp from the cold outside. The cracked oath ring on his hand looked dull now, but Lyra could feel it even from across the room. A cold pulse. A buried bell. "You did not eat," he said. Lyra glanced at the tray. "I was not hungry." "That is not what I asked." Her mouth almost curved. "Almost. You sound like the ledger." "Then the ledger has sense." Silence settled between them. Not soft, but not sharp either. Kael looked toward the untouched bed. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You do not have to stand for me." Lyra's throat tightened. For 23 days, those words would have broken her. Now they only made her wary. "I know." Kael's gaze returned to her face. "Do you?" She did not answer. Outside the window, Silvermere's courtyard lay gray under morning mist. Somewhere below, wolves were gathering for another day of whispers. By now, everyone knew Maddox Greymark had lied. Everyone knew the Moonstone Ledger had named him. Everyone knew the Alpha King's ring had cracked. But knowing had never saved Lyra before. Kael seemed to understand that. "I am not here to ask for your testimony," he said. "Not yet." "Then why are you here?" "To tell you what will happen next before others twist it for you." Lyra turned fully from the window. Kael continued. "Garrick will argue jurisdiction. Silas will claim healer privacy. Maddox will say you misunderstood. Celeste will say I am compromised. Are you?" The question left her before caution could stop it. Kael went still. Lyra forced herself not to look away. "Compromised." A faint shadow crossed his face. "Something too restrained to be pain, and too honest to be pride." "I do not know what the bond is doing," he said. "But I know what I am doing." "And what is that?" "Following evidence." The answer was so plain that Lyra almost hated him for it. She wanted him to say something grand, something impossible, something that would let her dismiss him as another powerful man dressing control in prettier words. Instead, he gave her law, records, procedure, a path that did not require her to trust his heart, only his actions. Lyra crossed the room slowly. Her steps were careful, but she did not let herself reach for the wall. Kael saw the effort. He did not move to help her. Somehow, that restraint felt more intimate than a hand. She stopped beside the small writing desk. "There is another copy." Kael's eyes sharpened. "The witness record." Lyra nodded. "The first copy is hidden in the Moonstone Ledger's spine. But I made another before Silas locked the hall." "Where is it?" Lyra studied him. The king waited. No command. No impatience. No royal pressure rolling through the room to bend her answer out of her. So she knelt. Pain flashed bright enough to steal her breath. But she kept one hand on the desk and reached beneath the loose floorboard near the hearth. Her fingers found oilcloth. Kael's jaw tightened, but he still did not touch her. Lyra pulled the packet free and unfolded it on the desk. The page was older than the one in the ledger spine. Creased. Smudged. Marked in her own hand. Kael moved closer only after she stepped back. He read the names. Maddox Greymark. Silas Vale. Elder Corvin Thale. Nessa Vale. Then his gaze dropped to the final line, half hidden beneath a smear of old ink. His face changed. "Not much." "Enough." Lyra's pulse quickened. "What?" Kael turned the page toward the candlelight. The smudge silvered. A fifth name appeared. Celeste of Frostmere. The room went colder. Lyra stared at the letters. "That is impossible," she whispered. "Celeste only arrived yesterday." "No," Kael said. "Celeste arrived publicly yesterday." The oath ring gave one slow pulse. Lyra pressed a hand against the desk to steady herself. Why would she be at Silvermere that night? Kael looked at her then, and whatever he saw in her face made his voice lower. Because Maddox was never the center of this. Lyra thought of Celeste's perfect smile. The way she had looked at Lyra, not with surprise, but recognition. The way the Moonstone Ledger had knocked when Celeste spoke. A cold understanding moved through her. "They knew I found something," Lyra said. Kael waited. Lyra looked down at the copy. at the names that had cost her 23 days of silence and pain. Then she lifted her eyes. I did not survive this long so they could write me out of my own story. The oath ring warmed for the first time. Not enough to heal. Enough to answer. Kael bowed his head once. Not as a king to a subject, but as one witness to another. Then we make them read it aloud. By sunrise, the Blackstone Hall had been cleared for a royal hearing, not a trial. Not yet. Kael Noctharrow made that distinction in front of every elder, every guard, every nervous servant who had gathered along the walls, pretending not to listen. This is a preliminary inquiry, he said from the head of the long table. No sentence will be passed today. No punishment will be ordered without full council witness. Lord Garrick Thornfell's mouth tightened. He had wanted to call it an invasion. Kael had given him procedure instead. That made it harder to fight. Lyra stood near the Moonstone Ledger with the copied witness record folded inside her sleeve. She had not slept. Her body ached with the heavy, distant throb of a storm that refused to break. But her mind felt painfully clear. Across the hall, Silas Vere stood in his gray healer's coat. One hand, resting on a leather-bound book clutched against his ribs. The healer ledger. He had brought it only because Kael had sent 3 Nightcrest guards and a written royal order. Even now, Silas held it as if the book were innocent. As I have already explained, Silas said carefully, healer records are private under Silvermere law. Kael sat perfectly still. Private records remain private. False records do not. A whisper moved through the hall. Silas's eyes flicked toward Garrick. Garrick gave him nothing. Celeste Frostmere stood beside the western pillar in white velvet, her veil pinned neatly over silver-blonde hair. She looked calm again, which made Lyra trust her even less. Your Majesty, Celeste said gently. Surely we must be careful. A healer's ledger contains intimate matters. If every frightened servant can demand public inspection, what happens to order? Lyra looked at her. Order for whom? Celeste's smile did not move. For everyone? No, Lyra said. For the people whose names are never removed from meal boards. For the people whose injuries are believed before they speak. For the people allowed to heal behind closed doors instead of standing in public until someone important notices. The hall went silent. Kael did not smile. But the cracked oath ring on his hand warmed with a faint silver light. Silas swallowed. I treated you according to your condition. Then open the ledger, Lyra said. Her voice was quiet. It carried anyway. Silas's fingers tightened over the cover. Kael leaned forward. Healer Silas Vere. Under royal decree of Nightcrest and provisional witness law, you are ordered to open the entry for Lyra Ashenvale, dated 23 days ago. Silas did not move. The Moonstone Ledger's clasp clicked once. Kael's voice dropped. Do not make the record ask twice. Slowly. Silas placed the healer ledger on the table and opened it. Pages turned beneath his careful hands. Fever treatments, training sprains, childbirth records, border patrol wounds. Then he stopped. Lyra saw her own name at the top of the page. Lyra Ashenvale. Minor injury. Routine training. Salva given. Cleared for duty. It was exactly the lie she expected. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then Kael lifted his ringed hand over the page. The frost-white stone cracked wider, and cold light spilled across the ink. The lower half of the entry began to darken. Silas backed away. No, he whispered. The black ink thinned like mist beneath moonlight. Under it, another layer appeared. Sharper, older, written in Silas's own hand. Lyra Ashenvale arrived in distress. Condition inconsistent with training fall. Immediate rest advised. Full report recommended before Alpha Regent. The hall breathed in, as one body. Lyra stared at the words. Not because they surprised her. Because someone had written the truth once. Someone had seen it clearly enough to record it. Then chosen to bury it. Kael looked at Silas. Who ordered the change? Silas said nothing. The healer ledger turned a page by itself. A second note appeared at the margin. Revised after private meeting with Lord Garrick Thornfell. Garrick's face emptied. Every elder near him stepped back by half an inch. Not enough to be brave, enough to be noticed. Garrick gave a thin laugh. Administrative correction. Healers often exaggerate early impressions. The royal ring snapped with a clean, cold sound. Lyra gasped and pressed one hand beneath her ribs. The lie had brushed that hidden place again. Kael saw it instantly. So did Celeste. For the first time, her eyes dropped to Lyra's hand, not with contempt, but calculation. Kael stood. Every time one of you lies about this girl, the curse answers through her. Silas's face had gone gray. That is impossible. No, Kael said. It is inconvenient. Lyra looked from the healer ledger to Garrick. You knew, she said. Garrick's eyes hardened. I knew a pack could not be torn apart over one girl's confusion. The Moonstone Ledger opened behind Lyra. Its pages turned fast, silver flashing through the air. Then it stopped on a blank page and wrote 5 words. She was never one girl. Celeste's hand closed around the edge of her veil. Kael read the sentence, and his expression changed into something colder than anger. Clear the hall, he ordered. Garrick stepped forward. You have no right. I have every right to protect a witness whose identity your pack has falsified. Lyra's pulse slowed. Identity. Not injury. Not just the missing witness list. Something larger had been hidden under her name. Kael turned to her, his voice lowering so only she could hear. Lyra, there is more in these records than what happened that night. She looked at the glowing page, then at the wolves who had spent years calling her ordinary, fragile, forgettable. What am I? Behind her, the Moonstone Ledger answered before Kael could. The silver veil has not yet been called. The words on the Moonstone Ledger did not fade. The silver veil has not yet been called. Lyra stared at the sentence until the letters seemed to move beneath her eyes. Silver veil. Called. Every word felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone ancient. Someone important. Not a girl who had spent years filing other people's names while her own was slowly erased. Lord Garrick Thornfell recovered with a sharp breath. This is absurd, he said. Old magic speaks in riddles. It proves nothing. Kael Noctharrow turned to him. No, he said, but it tells us where to look. Celeste Frostmere stepped away from the western pillar, her white veil whispering over the black floor. Your Majesty, surely you are not considering the moonlit witness right. The hall changed around the phrase. Even the elders looked afraid. Lyra's gaze moved from face to face. What is that? No one answered her. Kael did. A royal hearing right, he said, older than Silvermere law. A protected witness steps into an oath circle beneath moonlight. The ledger, the healer record, and the oath stone are placed before the court. If the witness speaks willingly, no ranked wolf may silence, punish, or command them until the testimony is complete. Willingly, the word struck deeper than the rest. Lyra looked at him carefully. And if I refuse, then you refuse. Garrick scoffed. A convenient performance. Of course she will agree if you make it sound noble. Kael's eyes did not leave Lyra. I am not asking for him, he said. I am asking for the record. You may say no. The hall seemed to tilt. Lyra had been ordered to stand, ordered to work, ordered to forget, ordered to accept the word accident as if it were a bandage. But no one had asked her what she chose. She looked at the healer ledger, where Silas's first truth had reappeared beneath the lie. She looked at Nessa, who stood near the door with tears on her face and shame in her hands. She looked at Celeste, whose perfect calm was beginning to crack around the edges. Then she looked at Garrick. For 23 days, she had been afraid of him. Now she was tired of giving him the largest room inside her fear. I will do it, Lyra said. The Moonstone Ledger closed with a soft, satisfied sound. By dusk, the courtyard had been transformed. The old oathstone was dragged from the chapel arch and set in the center of the black stone square. It was taller than Lyra's waist, carved with worn moons and ancient law marks. 3 ledgers rested before it. The Moonstone Ledger, Silas's healer ledger, and the mealboard record Kael had ordered, brought from the kitchens. Silvermere gathered in a wide circle. No one laughed now. No one called her fragile. Above them, the moon rose thin and pale behind drifting clouds. Kael stood outside the circle, not within it. Celeste stood across from him in white. Garrick stood with the elders, his face carved into patience. Maddox Greymark had been brought under guard, his golden smile gone hard and flat. Lyra stood at the edge of the oath circle. Her legs trembled. Not from fear alone, Kael noticed. He took one step, then stopped himself. The restraint steadied her more than help would have. "This rite begins only when you step forward," he said. Lyra breathed in. Then she entered the circle. Cold light rose from the oathstone. It climbed around her feet, not touching, not trapping, only marking the place where lies would have to pass through truth before reaching her. A faint burn stirred beneath the skin of her left wrist. Lyra looked down. A silver mark glimmered there, thin as moon thread, shaped like a veil caught in wind. The crowd whispered. Celeste's face went white. Kael's ring warmed with soft light. Lyra lifted her wrist, and the whispers died. "My name is Lyra Ashenvale," she said, "for 23 days. Silvermere Pack called what happened to me an accident." The oathstone pulsed. They were lying. A cold wind swept through the courtyard. Lyra turned first to Silas. "You saw the truth and changed it." Silas lowered his eyes. Then to Nessa. "You saw me near the old training yard." Nessa sobered once. "Yes." Lyra did not soften. "Not yet." Then she turned to Maddox. "You laughed because you thought no one would ever choose my word over yours." Maddox's jaw tightened. "You cannot prove." The oathstone flashed black. He stopped. Finally, Lyra faced the pack. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "You all saw me standing, day after day. You saw me fade. You heard me say it hurt. And every time you looked away, you helped them write the lie deeper." No one moved. No one breathed. Lyra raised her marked wrist higher. "You saw me," she said. "Why did you look away?" The Moonstone Ledger opened. One by one, names began writing themselves across the page. The Moonstone Ledger wrote names until the courtyard could no longer pretend it was witnessing one girl's grief. It was witnessing a pack's confession. Elda Marrow, Nessa Vale, Healer Silas Vare, Elder Corvin Thale, 3 guards from the northern post, 2 kitchen maids, a stable hand, a council clerk, then more. Not all had hurt Lyra with their hands. Most had done something easier. They had heard. They had seen. They had accepted the word accident because it cost them nothing and cost Lyra everything. The names glowed silver beneath the moon. Lord Garrick Thornfell watched the page fill. And for the first time, his calm began to fracture. "This rite has gone far enough," he said. No one moved to stop him when he stepped forward. That was Silvermere's oldest habit. Make room for power. Kael Noctharrow stood just outside the oath circle. His expression still, his cracked ring burning faintly with cold light. "The witness has not finished. She has finished accusing half my pack." She asked a question. Garrick's eyes cut to Lyra. A dangerous question from a girl who does not understand law. The oathstone dimmed, not because he spoke truth, because he had found a different weapon. Lyra felt it before he named it. Pack law. Old words. Old chain. The kind written by wolves who believed peace meant keeping the wounded quiet. Garrick lifted one hand. And Elder Corvin, pale but obedient, opened a narrow black book bound in cracked leather. "Silvermere Pack Law," Garrick said. voice growing stronger. Forbids any member of lesser rank from bringing public dishonor upon the pack during a royal treaty, unless the accusation has already been approved by council review. Lyra stared at him. A laugh almost rose in her throat. Council review. The same council that had buried the record, Garrick continued. By stepping into this right before proper internal order was completed, Lyra Ashenvale has violated pack unity, endangered an alliance, and exposed private affairs to outside power. A murmur moved through the courtyard. Fear shifting shape. Not fear of what had been done to Lyra, fear of what her truth might cost them. Celeste Frostmere stepped forward with sorrow, painted perfectly across her face. "This is tragic," she said softly. No one denies the girl suffered confusion and distress. But pain can be guided by those who wish to use it. Lyra's eyes found hers. Celeste did not look away. "You believe His Majesty is using me?" Lyra asked. "I believe powerful men are not the only danger." Celeste's voice lowered. "Sweet enough to poison tea?" Sometimes a wounded girl discovers that tears can move a kingdom. The oath stone did not flash. Celeste had learned not to lie directly. Kael's gaze sharpened. Garrick seized the moment. For her own safety, and to preserve order, I propose Lyra Ashenvale be removed from Silvermere's records authority and placed under temporary supervision. Supervision, Lyra repeated. Her marked wrist burned. Celeste turned toward Kael. Nightcrest could take her as a ward. Quietly, respectfully, away from these painful memories. There it was. Not justice. Containment. A prettier room. A softer cage. A new word for silence. The courtyard waited for Kael to rage. He did not. Instead, he looked at Soren Veilheart, who stood beside the royal guards. Soren. Soren opened a black folder sealed with Nightcrest silver. Under royal decree, no pack law may punish a protected witness for testimony given freely inside a moonlit witness right. Garrick's jaw tightened. That protection applies to recognized citizens of royal jurisdiction. Lyra Ashenvale is Silvermere born. The Moonstone Ledger trembled. Kael's eyes moved to it. So your defense, he said slowly, depends on who she is. Garrick went still. Too still. Celeste's fingers tightened around her veil. Lyra felt the whole courtyard narrow. Kael stepped toward the oath stone but did not enter the circle. Bring the birth records. No one obeyed. That silence answered too much. Kael's voice dropped. Bring them. A clerk stumbled into the records hall and returned carrying a narrow silver-edged book. His hands shook as he placed it beside the Moonstone Ledger. The pages turned by themselves. They stopped on the year of Lyra's birth. Her entry was there. Lyra Ashenvale, daughter of Marin Ashenvale and unknown father. Rank, dependent ward. But the ink around unknown father had been scraped thin. Beneath it, another line pulsed. Royal custody seal transferred under emergency concealment. The courtyard erupted into whispers. Lyra could not breathe. Ward, not daughter. Transferred, not born only to Silvermere. Garrick snapped the book shut. But the words had already been seen. Kael looked at him with cold understanding. You were never only hiding what Maddox did. The oath ring glowed brighter. You were hiding what Lyra is. Celeste's calm broke for one heartbeat, revealing raw panic beneath the silk. Lyra looked from the closed birth record to the wolves who had called her nothing. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. What am I? No one answered. Then the Moonstone Ledger opened again. Silver ink formed one sentence across the page. The Silver Veil heir was hidden in Silvermere. The courtyard did not recover from the sentence. The Silver Veil heir was hidden in Silvermere. For years, Lyra Ashenvale had been called small things. Wart, burden, quiet girl, records keeper. Only Lyra. Now the Moonstone Ledger had named her something old enough to make elders forget how to breathe. Lord Garrick Thornfell reached for the birth record again. But Kael Noctharrow's voice stopped him. Touch that book, Kael said, and I will have your hands removed from every seal of authority in this pack. Garrick froze. No shouting. No spectacle. Just a royal promise, made in a voice cold enough to stand as law. Celeste Frostmere stepped back into shadow, her white veil trembling, where her fingers gripped it. She recovered quickly. But Lyra had seen the panic. Not surprise. Recognition. You knew, Lyra said. Celeste's eyes lifted to hers. For one heartbeat, all softness vanished. Then she smiled. Careful, little heir. Celeste whispered. Old names wake old graves. The oath stone went dark. Kael turned sharply, but Celeste had already lowered her gaze. Innocent as winter glass. The hearing ended under royal order. Not because the truth was finished, because the truth had become too large for a courtyard full of frightened wolves. By nightfall, Kael stood in the old chapel passage with Lyra at his side. The corridor had been locked for decades, according to Silvermere's records. But when the Moonstone Ledger revealed Lyra's hidden custody seal, one detail had appeared in the margin. East Chapel Archive. Raventhorn mark. Do not open before the heir speaks. Lyra had spoken. So Kael opened it. The iron key turned with a sound almost human, like a breath released after years underground. Dust waited beyond the door. Not ordinary dust. Silver dust. It lay over broken pews, cracked moon tiles, and old black candles burned down to frozen stubs. At the far end stood a narrow altar carved from pale stone. Above it, someone had etched a veil into the wall, its flowing lines half covered by ash. Lyra stopped at the threshold. Her wrist burned. The silver veil mark glimmered beneath her skin. Faint, but awake. Kael noticed and stepped back, giving her room. What is this place? She whispered. A sealed chapel, he said. But not Silvermere's. He brushed dust from the altar. Beneath it lay a name carved in old script. Sybil Raventhorn. The air changed. The black candles sparked to life one by one, burning with blue-white flames. Lyra's breath caught. A woman's voice moved through the chapel, dry as parchment and soft as snow. If the heir hears this, then the first lie has broken. Silver light climbed the wall. Words appeared beneath the carved veil. Not painted, remembered. Kael read them silently. But Lyra spoke them aloud, because something in her mark demanded it. The silver veil was never a crown. It was a witness line, born to stand where courts become false, born to call hidden records from stone, ink, and oath. Hide the child until the Frost Veil King arrives. Do not let the false bride see the mark before the veil is called. False bride. Lyra's blood went cold. Celeste, she whispered. Kael's jaw tightened. Yes. The wall brightened again. A final line appeared. The curse will not break when the king is loved. It will break when the king chooses truth over the throne that benefits from silence. Kael did not move. Lyra turned to him slowly. The chapel flames bent toward his ring. You knew there was a prophecy, she said. I knew pieces. And did you know I was part of it? No. The answer came without hesitation. The oath ring remained warm. Truth. Lyra looked back at the wall. At Sybil Raventhorn's warning. At the word heir, glowing like a burden someone had hidden inside her life without permission. I do not want to be a symbol, she said. Kael's voice softened, but only slightly. Then do not become one for them. She looked at him. Become yourself first. For a moment, the chapel felt less cold. Then a crash sounded from somewhere above. Both of them turned. Another crash followed. Distant. Heavy. Wood splintering against stone. Kael moved first, opening the chapel door as Nightcrest guards came running from the passage. Records Hall. One said, the seal has been broken. Lyra's heart dropped. They reached the main corridor as smoke-colored frost rolled under the records hall doors. Not fire. Not heat. A cold destruction spell. Inside, the Moonstone Ledger slammed against its chain. Pages thrashing like trapped wings. Maddox Greymark stood near the central table with a black iron blade in his hand, its edge glowing with runes. Beside him, Celeste Frostmere's white sleeve vanished through the rear door. Kael's voice turned deadly quiet. Maddox. Maddox looked up, wild-eyed. She told me it was only a book. Lyra stepped past Kael before he could stop her. The ledger's pages stilled at the sound of her breath. Across the open page, silver ink wrote one warning. If the ledger falls, the meal record must speak. The warning burned across the Moonstone Ledger. If the ledger falls, the meal record must speak. For 1 second, no one moved. Then Maddox Greymark raised the black iron blade again. Kael crossed the room faster than thought. He did not strike Maddox. He did not need to. One sharp command from the Alpha King dropped the air so heavily that Maddox staggered back, the blade clattering onto the stone floor. Nightcrest guards seized him at once. Maddox struggled once, then stopped when Kael looked at him. Who gave you the blade? Maddox's face was pale with sweat. I said already. She told me it was only a book. Celeste. He did not answer. The royal oath ring flashed cold. Lyra felt the lie brush her ribs. But weaker this time. She was learning the shape of it. Lies did not own her. They only revealed themselves through her. Kael turned toward the rear door. Find Lady Frostmere. 2 guards vanished into the corridor. Lyra moved to the Moonstone Ledger. The chain holding it to the table had cracked. The moonstone clasp was split down one side, and several pages had gone blank, their silver ink fading as if breath had been stolen from them. No, she whispered. For 23 days, Silvermere had tried to erase her with silence. Now Celeste had tried to erase the record itself. The ledger's pages trembled beneath Lyra's hand. Not dead. Wounded. Kael came beside her. Close enough for warmth. Far enough not to crowd. Can it still testify? Lyra looked at the warning again. If the ledger falls, the meal record must speak. The kitchens, she said. Kael understood instantly. The meal ledger. Behind them, Elda Marrow made a small sound. Lyra turned. The old cook stood near the doorway, face gray, hands folded into her apron as if prayer could hide them. You know something, Lyra said. Elda's lips trembled. Garrick, who had been dragged from the council chamber by the noise, stepped into the doorway. Elda, careful. That single word did what threats had done for years. Elda shrank. Then her eyes moved to Lyra, to the torn hem of her gray dress, to the hand still resting on the damaged ledger, to the girl she had known since childhood and failed anyway. No, Elda said. The word was small, but it was the first brave thing she had said all night. Garrick's expression hardened. You forget yourself. I remembered myself. Elda whispered, then louder. I remembered too late. The room went silent. Elda looked at Kael. The meal board was changed 2 years ago. Not openly. Never openly. Lord Garrick ordered certain names placed beneath ranked families, then beneath warriors, then beneath visiting merchants, then not written unless food remained. Lyra felt the floor tilt beneath her. Kael's voice was quiet. Lyra's name. Elda nodded, tears spilling now. At first, only on punishment days. Then after the incident, her name disappeared almost entirely. I slipped her bread when I could. Lyra remembered. A heel of bread beneath a folded cloth. A cup of watered broth left near the records counter. Kindness so small, it had never been strong enough to challenge cruelty. Why didn't you say anything? Lyra asked. Elda pressed both hands to her mouth. Nessa answered from the doorway, voice breaking. Because everyone who helped you quietly was still afraid to help you loudly. The truth landed harder than accusation. Kael turned to his guards. Bring the kitchen meal ledger. Now. Garrick stepped forward. Kitchen records are not legal evidence. The cracked royal ring glowed. Kael did not look at him. They are when hunger is used to weaken a protected witness. Minutes later, 2 guards returned with a heavy brown ledger smelling of flour. Smoke. and old grease. Elda took it with shaking hands. No one else knew where to turn. She did. Pages flipped under her fingers. Winter stores. Harvest rationing. Festival meals. Servant portion. Then she stopped. Lyra's name had been written. Crossed out. Written again. Then removed so many times the paper was scarred. Beside each alteration was a small approval mark. G. T. Garrick Thornfell. The initials glowed silver. Kael looked at the pack lord with cold disgust. You starved her slowly enough to call it order. Garrick said nothing. The meal ledger turned a page by itself. A hidden column appeared in silver ink. Names omitted by command. Lyra Ashenvale. Marin Ashenvale. 3 orphaned ward children. 2 elderly Omegas. A sick pup from the East Nursery. The room changed. This was no longer only Lyra's story. It never had been. Elda stepped forward. Shaking so badly Nessa had to steady her elbow. I will testify, Elda said. Before the Alpha Council. Before the Oath Stone. Before anyone. Garrick's face twisted. You think one cook can ruin me? No, Lyra said. She lifted the meal ledger in both hands. But the record can. From the damaged Moonstone Ledger, one final silver spark drifted into the meal book. The brown pages turned moon white at the edges. And across the open spread, new words appeared. The silenced have been counted. Bedone. Silvermere's black stone hall no longer belonged to Silvermere. It belonged to the record. 3 Alpha Council banners hung above the long table, each one silver-edged and severe beneath a cold morning light. Council witnesses from neighboring packs had arrived before sunrise. Summoned by Kael Noctharrow's royal decree. No one could call this gossip now. No one could call it a girl's confusion. At the center of the hall stood 3 books. The Healer Ledger, the Meal Ledger, the copied witness record, and beside them, cracked but still glowing faintly, lay the wounded Moonstone Ledger. Lyra Ashenvale stood behind the table with her marked wrist uncovered. The silver veil mark shimmered beneath her skin like moonlight trapped under thin glass. Every time someone looked at it too long, they looked away first. Kael stood several steps to her right. Not in front of her. Never in front of her. Lord Garrick Thornfell was brought in under guard. His ceremonial coat buttoned wrong at the collar. Silas Vere followed with his eyes lowered. Maddox Greymark came last. Jaw tight. Golden arrogance worn thin by fear. Celeste Frostmere entered without chains. That was the most dangerous thing about her. She still looked like a queen from a winter painting. White veil pinned perfectly. Silver blonde hair smooth. Hands folded as if she had come to mourn a misunderstanding. The eldest council Alpha struck the oath stone once. This hearing begins under moonlit witness law and royal decree of Nightcrest realm. False testimony will be marked. The oath stone brightened. Kael placed the Healer Ledger first. Healer Silas Vere recorded Lyra Ashenvale's condition, truthfully. Then altered the entry after a private meeting with Garrick Thornfell. Silas closed his eyes. The ledger opened to the restored page. Silver ink rose beneath the false record, revealing the original note. The Council Alpha read it silently. Then aloud. The hall listened. Lyra did not lower her head. Kael placed the meal ledger beside it. Garrick Thornfell also approved the removal of Lyra's name from food records, along with other wards, elderly Omegas, and children under pack protection. A shocked murmur passed through the council witnesses. Garrick finally snapped. Rationing is not cruelty. It is governance. The oath stone turned black at the center. The hall fell silent. Kael's voice remained calm. Governance does not hide initials in servant ledgers. Then he placed the copied witness record on the table. Maddox Greymark was present at the old northern training yard. So were Silas Vere, Elder Corvin Thale, Nessa Vale. His eyes lifted. And Celeste Frostmere. Celeste gave a soft, wounded laugh. Your Majesty, she said, I understand your concern for the girl. Truly, but I had never set foot in Silvermere before my public arrival. The oath stone went still. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Celeste smiled. Then Lyra stepped forward. Not Kael. Lyra. She placed her marked wrist above the copied record. The silver veil mark flared. The oathstone turned so cold that frost spread across the table. Celeste's smile vanished. The witness record silvered at the edges. And beneath Celeste's name, a hidden notation appeared, entered under chapel seal, authorized by Nightcrest proxy. Kael went utterly still. Soren Veilheart inhaled sharply behind him. Celeste looked at the page. Then, at Kael. And for the first time, hatred showed through her beauty. You should have married me, she whispered. The curse would have slept. No, Lyra said. Her voice was not loud. It carried through the hall anyway. You wanted it sleeping because you knew what would wake it. Celeste's eyes cut to her. You are a records girl, wearing a dead title. Lyra lifted the damaged Moonstone Ledger. No, I am the girl you failed to erase. The oathstone flashed silver. The Council Alpha rose slowly. Celeste Frostmere. You gave false testimony before Council Witness. Celeste's perfect mask cracked. I protected the realm from a dangerous inheritance. Kael's ring blazed cold white. No, he said. You protected a lie that served you. The council guards moved toward her. Celeste did not resist. She only looked past them to Kael. Ask your own court why they sent me here, she said softly. Ask Nightcrest who signed the proxy seal. The room changed. Kael's face did not. But Lyra felt the bond between them tighten. Not like a claim. Not like a chain. Like warning. The frost veil curse had not broken. It had only turned its gaze home. Lyra looked at Kael. He looked back. And for the first time since entering Silvermere, the Alpha King seemed less like winter judgment and more like a man standing at the edge of his own buried truth. The Moonstone Ledger opened one final time. Silver ink wrote across the damaged page. The last false record waits beneath the silver throne. The last false record waits beneath the silver throne. The sentence followed Kael Noctharrow all the way back to Nightcrest realm. It traveled in the silence of the royal carriage. It waited in the frost, gathering along the windows. It lived in the careful distance between him and Lyra Ashenvale, who sat across from him with the damaged Moonstone Ledger on her lap and the meal ledger wrapped in black cloth beside her. Nightcrest Palace rose from the mountain like a crown carved from winter itself. Black towers, silver bridges, windows bright as watchful eyes. Lyra had imagined fear would return when she entered a royal court. Instead, she felt something colder. Clarity. Silvermere had taught her that rot could wear familiar faces. Nightcrest was teaching her that rot could also wear crowns. The royal court gathered before sunset. Nobles lined the silver hall in dark velvet and pale jewels. Council lords stood beneath banners embroidered with a split moon of Nightcrest. At the far end, raised above 7 black steps, waited the silver throne. Kael did not sit on it. That was the first thing everyone noticed. He stood before it, his cracked oath ring uncovered, and turned to the court. Under Alpha Council witness, he said. The Silvermere hearing revealed falsified records, witness intimidation, illegal rationing, and concealment of a protected heir. A wave of whispers passed through the hall. Lyra stood beside the evidence table, not behind Kael. Her silver veil mark was bare beneath her sleeve, glowing faintly whenever the court looked too long and lied too quietly. Celeste Frostmere had been brought in under guard. Her white veil was gone now. Without it, her beauty seemed sharper, less holy, more human. Kael looked toward the council. The final seal, used to enter Silvermere under chapel authority, came from Nightcrest. No one spoke. Then Lord Halvrin, one of the oldest royal advisors, stepped forward. A necessary measure, he said. The Silver Veil inheritance was unstable. The court acted to preserve peace. The oath ring froze white. Lyra felt the lie strike the room. This time, it did not bend her. She stepped forward and placed the Moonstone Ledger at the foot of the throne. Then let the record speak. The silver throne groaned. Not loudly, not like a monster, like stone remembering it had once been honest. A hidden panel opened beneath the lowest step. Inside lay a thin black book sealed with old silver wax. Soren Veilheart retrieved it and handed it to Kael. Kael broke the seal. The book opened to a single decree. Signed years ago by Nightcrest advisors and witnessed by Celeste Frostmere's family. Hide the Silver Veil child in Silvermere. Remove her from inheritance records. Bind the Frost Veil curse to silence until a suitable Luna is crowned. The hall went utterly still. Lyra looked at the words. Not with shock. With grief. Her whole life had been turned into an inconvenience before she was old enough to write her own name. Kael's face was pale and controlled, but his voice, when he spoke, carried through the hall like winter breaking. This throne benefited from her erasure. Lord Halvarin bowed stiffly. Your Majesty, the court acted before your reign, and I sit where they acted from. He turned then, not to the nobles, but to Lyra. I cannot undo what was stolen from you. Lyra's throat tightened. Kael removed the royal oath ring from his hand. The hall gasped. A Nightcrest king did not remove the ring in public, not unless he was abdicating, confessing, or making a vow too dangerous for parchment. Kael knelt on one knee before Lyra. Not to claim, not to command, to ask. The bond may choose us, he said quietly, but you still have the right to choose me. The cracked ring warmed in his open palm. Lyra looked at him for a long moment. This cold king who had not saved her by speaking over her. This ruler who had followed evidence when desire would have been easier. This man who had let the throne confess before the court. She took the ring, not to wear it, to place it on the evidence table beside every ledger that had finally spoken. I choose the truth first, she said. Kael's eyes softened. Then I stand with the truth. The Frost Veil curse broke without thunder. The ice inside the ring melted into silver light. It rose through the hall, touching the ledgers, the oath stone, the throne, and finally Lyra's marked wrist. The silver veil mark shone once, bright and clear, then settled beneath her skin. Not a cage, an inheritance. Badan. Kael issued the first royal decree of the new reign. No pack under Nightcrest could remove a ward. Servant. Orphan. Wolfless wolf. Elderly Omega. Or rejected mate from food. Healing. Witness rights. Or records protection. No healer ledger could be altered without oath review. No protected witness could be punished for speaking inside a lawful right. Garrick Thornfell. Silas Veur. Maddox Greymark. Celeste Frostmere. And the Nightcrest advisors who signed the hidden decree were stripped of authority and sent before council judgment. But Lyra did not watch them taken away. She was looking at the records table. A royal clerk, pale and shaking, opened the restored inheritance book. His quill hovered over the page for a long moment before he wrote the name Silvermere had tried to bury. Lyra Ashenvale, keeper of the Silver Veil, protected heir, witness of Nightcrest law. The ink turned silver, then black, then settled permanently into the page. Only then did Lyra breathe. Around the hall, other ledgers began to open. Meal records, healer records, ward records, names that had been crossed out, lowered in rank, or hidden under false seals, returned one by one. Elderly Omegas, orphaned children, servants without family names, wolves who had been called inconvenient until the law learned to forget them. Lyra watched every name appear, not because it healed everything, because it proved the truth had not stopped with her. A chair waited beside the records table. For a long moment, no one touched it. No one ordered her toward it. No one told her to stand straight. Be quiet. Endure. Or make peace easier for everyone else. Kael stood near the silver throne, watching her with the same careful distance he had given her from the beginning. Lyra stepped toward the chair. Slowly. Pain still lived in her body. Healing would not happen because a curse broke or a king knelt. Some wounds needed time. and some memories would always know the shape of the room where they were ignored. But this time, when Lyra lowered herself into the chair, no one looked away. The court watched. The Ledgers watched. Kael watched. And Lyra sat down. For the first time in 23 days, she sat not because the pain had vanished, but because the lie no longer owned the room. Silvermere did not become clean overnight. No kingdom did. But the records were opened. Names were restored. Meals were counted. Wounds were believed. And Lyra Ashenvale, once the girl who could not sit, remained beside the silver throne as keeper of the silver veil. Not because a king had given her dignity, because she had refused to let them write it out of her. This is a fictional story.